I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are discussing cross-border data transfers to China. Listeners have heard a lot of recent discussions on this podcast about the game-changing rules published by the U.S. Department of Justice that would prohibit or restrict specific types of U.S. data transfers to China and other countries of concern. While these rules are significant in their own right, they may just be the tip of the iceberg because the US is not making these changes in a vacuum. Other countries and stakeholders are taking note of the US-led concerns and raising similar protests. In particular, in the EU and UK, which, unlike the US, have long had cross-border data transfer rules. To discuss the current state of cross-border data transfer policy and how it interacts with today's geopolitics, I've invited my colleagues Eduardo Ustaran and Katie McMullan to the podcast. Eduardo is my co-lead of the privacy and cybersecurity practice here at Hogan Lovells, and Katie is counsel on the UK data protection team. Both Eduardo and Katie have long been data transfer practitioners, and I'm excited to have them join the podcast to provide a cross-Atlantic perspective on China-based data transfers, especially at this moment, where so many organizations are evaluating their connectivity to and with China. Eduardo, Katie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Eduardo, maybe I can start with you. Can you give us a background? Just draw us a picture about how cross-border data transfer issues have been presenting themselves primarily in the EU, but globally over the course of the past 10 or so years ago.
Certainly. Well, let me give you a bit of a history lesson going back to the mid-90s, where, of course, the origins of European data protection law as part of the EU legal framework started. And even in those days, when the original Data Protection Directive of 1995 was adopted, that already included a number of restrictions on international data transfers. And the reason for that was, of course, that framework was being created to protect European data, and the legislators wanted that protection to be extended, and therefore that protection was potentially at risk of being lost if that data was transferred to a different jurisdiction. That was a long time ago. If we fast forward to, say, 2015 was important because on the back of the disclosures around government access to data by Edward Snowden a couple of years earlier, the European Court of Justice took the rather radical decision to abolish what was then called the safe harbor, which was this arrangement between the European Union and the US to have this framework of protection around data. But the reason why that framework was abolished was because it was seen, or it was regarded by the court, that the potential access to personal data coming from Europe by US government agencies, particularly within the intelligence community, was at odds with this protection that European legislation had created for the data. That was then reenacted 5 years later with the Schrems II decision that led to the abolition of the Privacy Shield. And the reason why this is important is that following that Schrems II decision, we have lived for the past 4 years or so, 4 or 5 years, with a regime which essentially extends this prohibition that was created 30 years ago, but also includes a requirement to undertake a very rigorous transfer impact assessment to really assess whether data that is transferred, in this case from Europe to other jurisdictions that are not deemed to be adequate, would be protected in accordance with European standards. This is such a big deal that has been copied by other jurisdictions, and that has opened the door for these restrictions to be examined in a very dogmatic way. So here we are, 30 years after this idea of prohibiting or restricting international data transfers was devised or conceived in some way. The internet has obviously evolved a long way since those days, but suddenly we find ourselves under perhaps a greater level of dogmatism and restrictions that we have ever been. And of course, now when we look at the geopolitical tensions, particularly affecting the US and China, we are frankly facing a pretty unprecedented situation where these restrictions are possibly going to be taken to a different level. So I'll stop there just by way of setting the scene here.
So, Eduardo, that's really interesting. And maybe, Katie, I'm interested in your perspective. Why regulate the cross-border data transfers? In other words, this is kind of a set of policies that I think originated within the EU and has since been exported to a number of other countries. But what is driving the need for cross-border data transfer obligations?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So I think essentially this is all driven by this idea that it's a concept in data protection law of protecting data wherever it is geographically. So I think, the primary reasoning behind this was originally to ensure that data protection followed the data, no matter where it was transferred internationally. But of course, there are also secondary reasons, maybe more political or geopolitical reasons why this sort of regulation is becoming increasingly popular. So you might look at it from sort of a trade or a protectionism perspective as well.
Yeah, so lots of things get essentially kind of pulled into this, is my guess.
Yeah.
And, maybe the other avenue is what's happening now in the United States, which is kind of approaching this set of issues from a very different perspective. As you both know, as we're kind of working through these issues globally, the Department of Justice in the US has finalized rules in the tail end of the Biden administration, which are now going into effect, that would limit the transfer of what they describe as bulk sensitive personal data to other jurisdictions. And here I want to make sure we're kind of thinking about it both broadly and narrowly. It's designed to not cover cross-border data transfers everywhere, and maybe in a similar way that the EU has approached it, but instead to specific countries that are seen to have adversarial relationships to the United States, in particular Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, Russia, and then importantly, China. And that's really where I'm hoping to kind of spend the rest of our conversation today, is focusing on that China piece, because much like companies operating in the United States, many of them don't have operations in Venezuela, North Korea, and Iran, but many of them have operations in China. And as a result, the restrictions, whether it be inside of the United States or whether it come out of Europe around cross-border data for China, will end up having significant impacts. And so maybe we just pause for a moment and think about laying out where those restrictions are coming from. So the US rules, I mentioned those, and that is going to have a significant component around how large amounts of data can be accessible to entities in China, persons in China, or entities or persons that are subject to Chinese law. And unlike what you were describing, Katie, a moment ago, of why is it that this is being regulated, it has nothing to do with the protection of personal data for individuals. It's not a consumer protection law. It instead is a national security law. And it's looking at these set of cross-border data transfers not for the purpose of trying to protect individuals, but instead to protect the country. Things like taking large amounts of data and allowing a third-party country to extort individuals, to train artificial intelligence, almost as if a country can be able to take all of the information they have about a specific general or intelligence officer and then create an AI model based on that individual to then decide about how that person will interact with the country or with decisions that they would make. All of those kind of things, which are going to involve the restriction of personal data, but in many ways have nothing to do with personal data, all around trying to protect the national security. And because of those developments, we will now see companies having to implement controls that will limit how data is being transferred from the US to China, and in many ways have to replicate the models that you all have been working with companies for a long time around cross-border data transfers, but now install them in the United States, which is a much different paradigm than we've ever had in the US before. And maybe in some ways can look similar to when you were helping clients in Argentina comply with cross-border data transfers and think about how to replicate EU models, or entities that were based in Brazil or based in Turkey or based in any of the other countries that have this type of paradigm. But different than perhaps you've had in those past is that it's not a set of rules or restrictions that are flexible. In fact, they're very dogmatic, to borrow Eduardo's term. They're very structured, specific, with almost a straight prohibition in many ways, than the ability of doing analyses to determine whether the cross-border data transfer is permitted through that type of data impact assessment or transfer impact assessment, Eduardo, that you mentioned a moment ago. And as a result, I think it's a change in how we are thinking about coming up with global approaches to cross-border transfers, in particular to China. And so I'm interested in kind of your perspective, because as that's developing here in the United States and will have significant compliance obligations associated with it, I don't think we can see this as development in a vacuum that's just only specific to, okay, now I need to do this for the United States, because this is really a moment where I think we're going to see a lot more in terms of scrutiny around transfers to China. And Eduardo, you and I have spoken many times that we also shouldn't be seeing what's happening in the United States and think that the Europeans are not going to take note. And the European regulators and legislatures are very much following the developments within the Trump administration and how their approach is for trade and for consumer protection laws in general. Interested in your perspective about how this Chinese focus will make its way on the other side of the Atlantic into Europe.
It is bound to have an effect on how international data transfers are regulated in Europe, in Turkey, in South America, in every country or every jurisdiction where international data transfers are restricted, irrespective of whether these restrictions are the result of an attempt to protect national security or an attempt to protect personal data and individuals' privacy. And the issue here is that whilst we have seen over the past 10 years, in particular in Europe, a great focus on restricting data transfers to the United States, for the reasons I was referring to earlier, whilst that is not going to go away, certainly this emphasis on China coming from the US will very likely be replicated again from a more privacy perspective in Europe. And what we are likely to see from a regulatory perspective is data protection authorities questioning and possibly applying the same type of criteria that they have been applying to transfers to the US, but transfers to China. And of course, the big risk here is that whilst in the US, we have seen some evolution, again, over the past 10 years towards perhaps greater controls over this government access to data. And frankly, a huge amount of transparency coming from the US government, even the previous Trump administration, certainly the Biden administration that was responsible for the data privacy framework, these massive efforts to in a way satisfy European standards. If that, in some cases, has not even been good enough from a European regulatory perspective, one wonders what could possibly be enough for the Chinese government to do and to show to the Europeans that they can control their own surveillance and their own access to personal data. So that's a big question mark, and obviously we're speculating here. But my immediate reaction is that certainly European data protection authorities will be paying attention and will be scrutinizing international data transfers to China more than they have ever done before.
And this is not a theoretical issue, because I think we're actually starting to see, these types of complaints come up. So Eduardo, you mentioned the long-standing interest around how data is transferred from Europe to the United States, and whether the United States is has a structure in place to comply with EU law. And that has been challenged repeatedly, multiple efforts between the European government and the US government to put in the structures to allow for those transfers by Max Schrems and his organization. And it seems now that he is also interested in transfers to China. Katie, what's happening there?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Scott. So earlier this year, Max Schrems' rights group, NOYB, has filed complaints to 5 European data protection regulators, really challenging the lawfulness of transfers to China by some Chinese-based retailers and social media companies. So according to Max Schrems' organization, these companies are allegedly unlawfully transferring data, including customer data, usage data from the EU to China. And NOYB is asking the data protection authorities to order those companies to suspend the transfer of data to China and to impose fines on those companies. Now, NOYB's position is that because China's legal framework fails to prevent authorities from accessing citizens' data, in their view, transfers of European data to China is a major privacy concern. So obviously it remains to be seen how these complaints will be handled by each of the DPAs that have received them. But I think it's a really good example to show, why data transfers to China are under increased scrutiny from Europe. And actually earlier today, Eduardo and I were having a conversation about why now. So, why is Max Schrems focusing on China, given that, he's been speaking about transfers to the US for some time? Why this sort of pivot, this change to data transfers from Europe to China? And, part of that is likely because of the US's focus, the federal ban on TikTok. If the US is concerned about data transfers to China, controlled companies, then, in his view, European businesses should be concerned as well.
I mean, it's been a long question that I think we've received, especially from our US-based clients, that say, why is there so much focus on the US when it comes to data transfers, but less focused on sending data, personal data from Europeans to other countries that, have less democratic systems? And that's always been probably amusing of people here in the US. And maybe it took a little bit while, but now we're starting to see that change. Eduardo, interested in your kind of views about, do you think that this will ultimately get to the point where the same type and levels of scrutiny that we saw with respect to US data transfers now apply to China? Or do you sense that that's not going to develop in the same way?
Time will tell. But if you just look at what has been the trajectory over the past, say, 10 years, it was the reason why, by the way, the US suddenly became the focus of attention was Edward Snowden and what he revealed to the world about the activities of the intelligence community in the US was the trigger for Schrems 1 and everything that has happened afterwards. Of course, no other country that I'm aware of has had the equivalent of an Edward Snowden. I don't think there is a Chinese Edward Snowden that has worked for the Chinese intelligence services and suddenly reveal all this information about the activities of the Chinese government or indeed any other country. And we may never have that. But of course, all the work that is being done right now to, in a sense, expose the activities of China, and sometimes there may be evidence, sometimes there may not be any evidence. But that adds to this perhaps obsession about which countries are maybe more dangerous in terms of this availability of data. And I think what we're going to see with China is that the same approach that was the result of the Schrems II decision, this idea of having to undertake an assessment of how the type of data that is being transferred to another jurisdiction may be the subject of access, and the powers of access of a particular government will be applied very rigorously to China. And there is, as I was saying earlier, there is very little information out there. We on our team, we have obviously our own team is in China itself, and we have undertaken a number of transfer impact assessments for our own clients in relation to this. And we have been able to advise clients on what mechanisms would be sufficient from a risk-based perspective to allow those transfers to take place. The real question is, where do you set the bar in terms of the risk? If that bar is a zero risk bar, in the sense that you need to categorically show that there is no chance whatsoever of the government, in the Chinese government in this case, of getting access to the data, is actually going to be very, very difficult. We don't live in a zero risk world in any respect whatsoever, let alone in relation to something like data, which is such a powerful strategic and economic asset. And therefore, the real question is, how do we approach this question in a pragmatic, sufficiently pragmatic way, but sufficiently rigorous way, so that we reconcile the requirement to protect the data with the fact that the data is not protected in a sort of safe, completely 100% safe way, but there may be an element of risk involved in that access to the data, and the protection has to be proportional to that level of risk. So how that plays out over the next few months, certainly by European data protection authorities, is yet to be seen. But certainly the direction of travel is linked to applying a pretty dogmatic view on this question.
And that may be worth just pausing a moment, because that analysis that you were just describing in those transfer impact assessments, as I understand it, and Katie, I'm interested in how this actually comes to be, is it's not that, it is completely unlawful for you to transfer data to China as a matter of fact. Instead, organizations need to analyze their transfers of data to China to make sure that data gets treated or afforded the same rights and protections as those individuals would receive under GDPR-oriented principles. In other words, if you transfer data under the standard contractual clauses, you would need to undertake an effort to make sure that the recipient can comply with both the principles set forth in the standard contractual clauses and also the local laws that apply to that entity once they're receiving it. And as a result, it's that review that is in part legal, part factual, with respect to documenting and determining how that transfer. Interested in your perspective on that, including how that type of review has been undertaken with respect to China.
Absolutely, Scott. So I think, it might be helpful if we just dial back a little bit to back in the summer of 2020, because I know, part of this is sort of explaining how we got to the point that transfer impact assessments need to be carried out. And I know Eduardo gave us a bit of background at the beginning, but the reason why I want to go back to summer of 2020 is, prior to the Schrems II decision, it was really common to, for parties to enter into the SCCs, standard contractual clauses, to sign them, chuck them in a drawer, and promptly forget about them. That approach really drastically had changed after Schrems II. And the emphasis has shifted to really ensuring that the data importer, the recipients of data under the SCCs, can effectively meet those obligations, as you said, Scott, that they can meet the obligations under the SCCs, but also as imposed by the local laws that apply to them. So the way in which you go through working out whether this is going to be possible in practice is to carry out a transfer impact assessment, working out whether there are actual privacy risks based on the legal framework in the recipient country, and working out if the parties have to implement additional safeguards to mitigate them. So originally, a lot of focus on TAAs at the beginning was around transfers to the US. So the outcome of Schrems II was that the CJ EU found that US national laws conflicted with the GDPR, but due to the introduction of the DPF, that situation has improved. So for transfers to other countries like China, that detailed transfer impact assessment remains a requirement. So in terms of what that means in practice, which I think is what your question was aimed at, Scott, we're working with clients to document the transfer impact assessments and the associated additional measures that might be needed to protect data. So looking at sort of the technical, the organizational, the contractual obligations around data handling that mean that data is effectively protected when it's received in China.
Yeah, and that maybe creates some flexibility in terms of designing that overall package of protections, whether it's contractual or technical, or the evaluation about how the law would apply, to give European-based transfers the ability of going to China, and maybe to contrast that against these emerging set of standards that are now set in the United States, is that those frankly just don't provide that same level of flexibility. In other words, it's prejudged that the laws of China or the laws of Venezuela, Cuba, or wherever will not afford the same protections with respect to this information. It's prejudged that if you were to implement a data transfer, that that information could very well become accessible to the Chinese government. And so the standard here is not necessarily a transfer impact assessment, but instead it is an assessment of your cybersecurity oriented controls that would be designed to prevent unauthorized access to the information. And it's not, and I say designed to protect, that's actually not even the standard. Because Eduardo, to your point a moment ago, the standard is actually much more strict. It is that you would have to have sufficient cyber controls that would, quote, fully and effectively prevent access to this data by the Chinese government. And that standard is really high. I don't know that there is an organization, a private organization can say that they have ever met that standard. I don't know that any government, frankly, could say that they have met that standard, because we see government hacks all the time, especially, when nation states can bring the resources of their governments to this type of offensive behavior. And as a result, we can implement all of these cyber controls, but in some ways, the way the US is thinking about it is it looks more like a strict liability standard than anything else. In other words, you can transfer data to China if you put all of these cybersecurity controls in place, but hey, beware that if any of those cybersecurity controls fail, you're potentially liable under these rules. And that's a very different, much more strident position than what Europeans have historically used. Interested in your perspective, or whether you agree with that contrast.
It is an evolution, I think, what we're seeing here, not towards a more flexible approach, but towards a more rigid approach. And you would have thought that after all these years, literally, at least in Europe, 3 decades of dealing with international data transfers and the digital economy evolving the way it is evolving, and AI becoming the driver. And by the way, AI, which of course requires a lot of data and therefore is by definition as global as everything else, will require a degree of at least pragmatism in relation to these issues around international data transfers. So I think it is fine to look at this and say, okay, if you think, you organization, you want to operate globally, if you take the view that your data is protected when it flows around the world, when it is stored in servers in all these different jurisdictions, when it is accessed by your subsidiaries in China or wherever else, then it's up to you to figure out how to do that. The law is clear in a way in terms of the standards of protection that it needs to meet. The challenge I see is when the question is not so much about, okay, it's up to you to figure out how to do it, but there is a presumption that no matter what you do, is never going to be good enough. And I think that is the direction of travel of the past couple of years, certainly in Europe. And my concern is that whilst that was manageable in the context of the US, and we can talk a bit about what could happen in relation to, for example, the data privacy framework in the US, but whilst that I still think is manageable, and the efforts of the US government, of frankly, any administration, are visible in that respect, what is not visible is, of course, the efforts that a country like China may make in order to ensure that their government is operating in a way that is conscious of the privacy protections that the European demands. And because of that reason, and if you then add the very dogmatic approach to this zero risk, then it becomes extremely challenging for anyone. And I guess this is our job, obviously, but it becomes very challenging to be able to satisfy these standards and to be able to say, well, look, we are confident that our system is such, and our technical and organizational measures, as Katie was referring to, are such that despite the potential for government access to data, the data will be protected. That becomes very, very challenging if that presumption is there that you can only do that if there is a zero risk approach.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. Eduardo, maybe I'm interested in your perspective about how we should think about the future of cross-border data transfers globally, because in some ways, and you and I have talked about this in the past, is that the cross-border data transfers restrictions or permissions are in some ways a reflection of the geopolitics of the day. And we're seeing now that from a national security perspective, as I mentioned, we're in this particular moment where there are lots of trade conversations going to be having. Some, think of that as a trade war. Data is being pushed into that issue. There's isolationist tendencies that we are seeing from a geopolitical perspective. In some ways, this data portion, the cross-border data transfer, just seems like it's wrapped around all of those things. Interested in your thoughts from a global perspective, how to think about that.
So 2 things to bear in mind that are happening and that are pretty certain. One, data transfers are not going to stop, in the sense that unless the world becomes 100% analog, and I don't think that will happen, and if that happens, we'll have bigger problems, then data will continue to flow because we will continue to communicate globally. We will continue to transact globally. We will continue to try to operate as a relatively harmonious planet. So the data will continue to flow. But at the same time, and I know I've just said it's a harmonious planet, the planet is anything but harmonious today. And if anything, I guess we are all very conscious of how instability is being injected from many different angles. And because of those two factors, the challenge is how to reconcile the fact that the data needs to flow and obviously be protected or responsibly protected, whilst these tensions exist. And let me give you an example of something that I think will need to happen. The US has changed its administration, and we are in the early days of the Trump administration, and we are already seeing a lot of change. Some of this change has affected those controls that the US has to allow for European data to be transferred and still be protected from government access to data. And one of the early decisions of the Trump administration has involved the dismissal of some members of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which is this body that perhaps not many Europeans know about, but is crucial for the transfer of data, the safe transfer of data from Europe to the US, because this is the body, or one of the bodies, that has the ability to oversee the potential access to data by the US government. So it's a tool of protection that the US government itself has. And that board has not been entirely dismantled, but it has been put under threat in a way, if you want to. So how Europe and the European authorities will react to that remains to be seen, but clearly, I think they need to ensure that on the one hand, the data is protected and the data privacy framework and the adequacy behind that still stands, while being realistic that these changes are taking place in the US government. And nobody knows exactly the effect of what these changes is going to be, even though they are already very present. And I think everyone needs to hold their nerve a little bit and try to ensure that what we have always seen as a mechanism for, or at least we've seen since it was created as a mechanism for transfers and something that was negotiated with the US and the EU will continue to be in place, as opposed to suddenly saying, oh, wow, Trump is now here, so forget transfers to the US. So I think dealing with these very, very live issues that we see in the news every day, and still being able to look at the transfers as something that need to happen for the world to operate is something that we really need to have on front of mind right now.
Yeah, really important perspective. And I would maybe add to that, Eduardo, is just this overlay that we're thinking about in the US is the connection between data and sanctions. You know, we've had long sanctions laws here in the US, but they've been focused primarily on financial oriented transactions. What is different and new is the US government is thinking about how to try to address these national security issues. Financial restraints are still part of it, but this in some ways reflects a decision, and that's different than we've ever had before, that we're going to think about data almost in the same way that we're thinking about a financial transaction. And, that is a different concept than I think many data lawyers, of which, we have three on this podcast, have think about it. And as a result, it is I think a new world of data protection that is not personal data specific, and instead it's much more thinking about data from other perspectives that are also wrapped up in the geopolitics of the time. And my guess is that theme will continue. We'll continue to see data as a form of currency almost, and we see that in the context of technology all the time. And now we're seeing that in the form of a new way of trying to protect national security. Katie, all of that presents a really unclear picture about how organizations can proceed in this dynamic, uncertain environment. Our goal, as Eduardo said, is to think about a solution, think about ways that we can actually facilitate and allow for business to occur, as opposed to coming up with ways to obstruct it. And that is increasingly difficult with all of these constraints and all of these important considerations that are being placed on us. Interested in your perspective about how clients who are struggling with this can approach this problem in a coordinated way.
Thanks, Scott. It's interesting. I just think, one thing we haven't talked about so far in the podcast, but that really stands out to me is sort of the MVP of data transfer mechanisms is binding corporate rules. And, the reason why I raise this is binding corporate rules is a data transfer mechanism that you can use to facilitate data flows from Europe. But it's so much more than that as well. And the reason why I bring it up in the context of the uncertainty that we're discussing is that I think, companies that take the decision to implement binding corporate rules within their organization have to think about how they're going to comply with data protection principles and think about how they're going to demonstrate those principles in practice. So, coming up with policies and procedures, complaints handling procedures, thinking about how they're going to deal with transfer impact assessments in practice. Binding corporate rules have to go through a process of being approved by regulators. So they go through a degree of scrutiny, but that degree of scrutiny that they go through means that they've had a high degree of standing despite, all this uncertainty we've had over the years. So they've really showed their staying power despite the challenges we've had with the data privacy framework and the SCCs along the ways. So I think, in terms of thinking of a solution, global businesses should be thinking about, whether binding corporate rules is something they want to invest in as a way of kind of overcoming the concerns. And I think in terms of things that we, organizations can be focusing on right now, transfer impact assessments, really thinking, going back to the ones that were done 2020 post Schrems 2 and updating them, revisiting any assessments that were done around transfers to China and really making sure that, there are consideration of technical, organizational, contractual measures and that they're documented. So yeah, I think some real practical, tangible steps to take there at least.
Those are, I think, really good practice points. I would add maybe a couple, because one of the great things about BCRs or the binding corporate rules is they force organizations who go through that really exhaustive process to really scrutinize their data transfers and to document it. It creates records that are impossible to produce without having to really carefully think about this. And as a result, it's much easier to react to these changing geopolitics and these new rules once you have that clear line of sight as to how data is being transferred outside of your organization, in this case to China. And that's a difficult issue that many multinationals are facing at this moment as they try to comply with the DOJ rules. A key question is, well, I don't know what transfers I have to China because I've never had to do anything more than I've always had to do. And so the BCR construct, in some ways, even if you're not certifying to BCRs, that same level of scrutiny creates a lasting value that organizations can use to become more resilient to this type of change. And the second thing I would add is to not think about data transfers maybe in the ways that we've thought about previously, more regional, right? What am I doing about transfers out of Europe? What am I doing about transfers out of Argentina, out of Brazil? I think at this moment, to do that is really going to be an effort of chasing. And instead, the opportunity is to think about data transfers around the world. Because if I'm thinking of all of the cybersecurity measures that are now required by the DOJ to allow for transfers to Europe, those would be the same types of things that I'm sure from a European perspective, we would want to be highlighting in our transfer impact assessments. And so if those two things are working hand in hand, you're putting in the controls in place to prevent access from a foreign government with respect to US data, and we could deploy those same controls for European data. Well, now we have solved two problems and not one with one control. And that to me is where the opportunity lies to do this in a much more coordinated, global oriented view than the regional localized one where I think many have focused on in the past. Maybe Eduardo, I'll give you the final word. Interested in your reaction to that or any other practice points you would highlight.
The way I would summarize this discussion really is, using your own word, see it as an opportunity. See it as not something that is going to suddenly eliminate your ability to operate globally, but quite the opposite. It's an opportunity to embed the protection in how you access, how you store data, but globally. Because no matter what level of scrutiny you face, first of all, if you are putting in place the right mechanisms that you think you can deploy globally, whether it's within your own organization or towards vendors, then that in itself, at the end of the day, this is not a box ticking exercise. This is real data, a real asset that we're trying to protect, and privacy is part of that. And the benefits of adopting a workable approach speak for themselves. But also from the point of view of complying with these legal requirements and the ability to have a very credible argument at the end of the day in front of a regulator, in front of a court, to say, nobody knows better the data that we use or we export than us. And we have assessed the level of exposure that this data may have, and we understand how best to protect it and still make it useful, of course. And I think looking at it from that perspective, as a way of enabling the data to flow once it is protected, is the way to look at this issue, irrespective of the geopolitics and irrespective of the tensions we're seeing. So I guess finishing with an optimistic note, even though this is going to involve a lot of work for many, many people.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to leave it. Eduardo, Katie, really appreciate your time and your insights and sharing that with our audience. Always love engaging in these issues, and my guess is that we will have to have future podcast episodes to follow all of the developments we are seeing in this space.
We'll look forward to it. Thank you.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.